Hello, and welcome to Sleepy History. We often gaze in wonder at the golden masks, the towering pyramids, and the intricate hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt. We imagine a world of divine pharaohs, powerful priests, and unimaginable luxury. But tonight, we're going to pull back that golden curtain. We're going to step past the throne and into the shadows of the palace corridors to explore the lives of the people who made all that splendor possible. Tonight, we discover why it truly sucked to be a servant in the Pharaoh's palace. But before we begin our journey down the Nile of the past, I have a simple question for you. As you settle in, notice the things around you that bring you comfort. What is the most comfortable object near you right now? Is it your pillow? A soft blanket? Let me know in the comments below. Now, it's time to let all of that go. Find that perfect position, the one where your body feels completely supported. Take a slow, deep breath in, filling your lungs with peace. And as you exhale, release the day. Let go of your to-do lists, your worries, your plans for tomorrow. They have no place here. Here there is only the sound of my voice, a steady, soothing rhythm to guide you toward slumber. There is no need to concentrate, no need to remember a single fact. Simply allow the story to be a gentle, flowing river, carrying you effortlessly into a deep and restful sleep. Our journey begins in the heart of the two lands, within the sun-drenched walls of the royal palace of the living god, the Pharaoh. Chapter 1: The Gilded Cage. To an outsider, a simple farmer toiling under the hot sun, the walls of the Pharaoh's palace must have seemed like the gateway to paradise. They were built of gleaming white limestone that shone like a beacon, topped with vibrant paint and inlaid with precious stones. Within those walls was a world of unimaginable luxury. There were shaded courtyards with cooling pools of water, gardens filled with fragrant flowers and exotic trees, and vast halls whose columns were painted with scenes of the gods and the great victories of the king. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the sound of music from a distant harp, and the gentle rustle of fine linen. To be chosen to serve within these walls was, in the eyes of the common person, the greatest honor one could achieve. It was a life of plenty, a life at the very center of the universe. But for those who lived it, this paradise was a gilded cage. The beauty of the palace was a constant, looming reminder of one's own lowly status. The servant was surrounded by a world of incredible wealth, yet owned nothing. They walked on floors of polished alabaster, but their own sleeping quarters were cramped, windowless, and shared with many others. They handled plates of gold and silver, but their own meals were simple affairs of bread, onions, and beer. The palace was not a home. It was a workplace, a stage upon which a grand drama of divine power was enacted every single day. And the servant was merely a stagehand, forever in the background, essential but invisible. Their purpose solely to ensure the flawless performance of their divine master. The world of the servant was governed by a rigid and unforgiving hierarchy. Not all servants were created equal. At the very top were the high officials, men of noble birth, who held titles like overseer of the royal household or chief steward. They wielded immense power within the palace walls and enjoyed a life of considerable comfort. But below them were countless layers of servitude. There were the personal attendants to the pharaoh and the great royal wife, the wig-makers, the manicurists, the sandal-bearers, the keepers of the royal wardrobe. These were positions of immense prestige, but also of incredible danger, for a single mistake made in such close proximity to the divine could have fatal consequences. Further down the ladder were the armies of cooks, bakers, and brewers who toiled in the sweltering heat of the palace kitchens. There were the launderers who spent their days scrubbing linen in the harsh lye, the cleaners who polished the endless floors, and the gardeners who tended the sacred plants. And at the very bottom were the laborers, the men and women who performed the most menial and physically demanding tasks, hauling water from the Nile, carrying heavy loads of supplies, and cleaning the palace drains. Each servant knew their place. They knew who to bow to, who to take orders from, and whom they could in turn command. This rigid structure was designed to maintain ma'at, the sacred concept of order, truth, and balance that was the foundation of the entire Egyptian universe. A servant who stepped out of their designated place was not just breaking a rule. They were committing an act of cosmic significance, threatening the very stability of the world. And so, life in the palace was a constant dance of deference and obedience, a performance of humility that had to be maintained from the moment one awoke to the moment one fell into an exhausted sleep. The price of this gilded cage was one's own identity, one's own freedom. You were not a person. You were a function, a title, a pair of hands to serve the living God. Chapter 1. The Dawn Chorus. Long before the first rays of the sun god Ra crested the eastern horizon, the palace was already stirring. There was no gentle awakening for a servant. The day began abruptly in the pre-dawn chill, with the sharp command of an overseer. Sleep was a luxury afforded to the gods on earth, not to those who serve them. The first task was a ritual of purification. Servants would wash themselves in cool water, not for comfort, but to be ritually clean before beginning their duties in the sacred space of the Pharaoh's home. Their clothing was simple, a coarse linen kilt or dress, a uniform of their station that allowed for movement but offered little comfort. Then the work began. The first and most important task of the day was to prepare the palace for the awakening of its divine master. This was the dawn chorus, a symphony of quiet, purposeful labor. Armies of cleaners would move through the vast halls and corridors, their footsteps silent on the cold stone floors. They carried torches and simple lamps, their flickering light casting long dancing shadows on the painted walls. Every surface had to be wiped clean of the desert dust that seeped in through even the smallest crack. Floors were swept with palm frond brooms and then sprinkled with water to keep the dust down, a task that would be repeated countless times throughout the day. The air had to be purified.
Attendants would walk through the rooms with incense burners, the fragrant smoke of myrrh and frankincense wafting through the halls, chasing away the staleness of the night and creating an atmosphere worthy of a god. In the kitchens, the fires had been roaring for hours. The bakers were already pulling the first batches of bread from the clay ovens, the air thick with the warm, comforting smell. But this was an industrial-scale operation. Hundreds, if not thousands of loaves had to be baked every day to feed the royal family, the high officials, and the vast population of the palace. Brewers checked on the massive vats of fermenting beer, the staple drink of every Egyptian, from the highest noble to the lowest laborer. Butchers were at work.
Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Divine. To serve the Pharaoh was to live in the shadow of a god. The king of Egypt was not merely a ruler. He was the earthly incarnation of Horus, the son of Osiris, the living link between the world of mortals and the realm of the divine. Every action he took, every word he spoke, was imbued with cosmic significance. And for a servant, to be in his presence was the most terrifying and awe-inspiring experience imaginable. It was an honor, yes, but it was an honor fraught with unimaginable peril. The etiquette surrounding the Pharaoh was a complex and rigid web of rules that took a lifetime to master. A servant never looked the Pharaoh directly in the eye. To do so was an act of profound disrespect, a challenge to his divine authority. One's gaze must always be directed at the floor. A servant never spoke unless spoken to, and even then their words must be carefully chosen, filled with elaborate praise and declarations of their own unworthiness. One did not simply walk into the Pharaoh's presence. One approached in a state of ritual obeisance, often on one's knees, the forehead touching the ground. This was not just a gesture of respect. It was a physical acknowledgement of the vast, unbridgeable gulf between the mortal servant and the divine king. Every aspect of the Pharaoh's daily life was a sacred ritual, and the servants were the silent, invisible facilitators of these rituals. The act of waking the Pharaoh was a delicate and dangerous task, performed by only the most trusted of his personal attendants. The morning ablutions, the process of washing and dressing the king, was a religious ceremony. Each garment, each piece of jewelry had a symbolic meaning, and to put them on in the wrong order or to handle them improperly was a grave offense. Even serving the Pharaoh his meals was a high-stakes performance. The food had to be presented in a specific way, on specific dishes, by servants who moved with a choreographed grace. A single dropped plate, a single spilled drop of wine could be interpreted as a bad omen, a disruption of the sacred order, and the servant responsible would face the full force of the king's divine wrath. The concept of ma'at, or divine order, was the central pillar of Egyptian belief. The Pharaoh's role was to maintain ma'at on earth, to ensure that the world remained stable and in balance.
The servant's role was to be a tiny, perfect cog in this grand cosmic machine. Their obedience, their silence, their flawless performance of their duties, all of this contributed to the maintenance of Ma'at. A clumsy servant, a disobedient servant, a lazy servant. These were not just personal failings. They were threats to the stability of the universe. This placed an incredible psychological burden on the shoulders of every person who worked in the palace. They were living in a constant state of high alert, their every move scrutinized, their every action judged against a standard of divine perfection. The fear was constant and pervasive. The Pharaoh held the power of life and death in his hands, and his moods were as unpredictable as the flooding of the Nile. A moment of irritation, a flash of anger, could result in a servant being beaten, imprisoned, or even executed on the spot. There was no trial, no appeal. The word of the living God was law. To live in his shadow was to understand in the most visceral way your own absolute powerlessness. You were a creature of dust and clay in the presence of the sun itself, and you knew that at any moment that sun could turn its scorching, unforgiving gaze upon you. Chapter 4: A Feast of Scraps. The royal kitchens of the Pharaoh's palace were a place of incredible, almost overwhelming sensory abundance. They were a vast complex of interconnected rooms filled with the constant roar of fires, the clang of copper pots, and the shouts of the chief cooks. The air was a thick, humid swirl of 1,000 different smells. The earthy aroma of baking bread, the sweet scent of roasting figs and dates, the savory perfume of spiced and sizzling meat, and the sharp tang of fermenting beer. The sheer quantity of food that passed through these kitchens on a daily basis was staggering. Entire herds of cattle, flocks of geese and ducks, and mountains of fish pulled from the Nile were brought in to feed the royal family and the vast court. Baskets overflowed with fresh vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, and cucumbers. Storehouses were filled to the ceiling with sacks of emmer wheat and barley, and giant pottery jars of honey, oil, and wine. For the cooks, bakers, and brewers who worked here, this was a world of constant, high-pressure labor. They toiled in the stifling heat of the clay ovens and open fires, their bodies slick with sweat. The pace was relentless, the demands of the royal table unending. They were masters of their craft, capable of creating elaborate dishes fit for a god. They could roast a whole ox on a spit, bake intricately shaped cakes sweetened with honey, and brew the finest beer in the two lands. Their skill was essential to the daily functioning of the palace and to the maintenance of the Pharaoh's image of divine provider. A great feast was a display of the king's power, a demonstration of the prosperity and abundance that his rule brought to the land. But for the very people who prepared this magnificent bounty, it was a feast for the eyes and the nose only. A servant's rations were a world away from the delicacies they prepared for their masters.
The standard pay for a laborer in ancient Egypt, including the lower-ranking palace servants, was a daily measure of bread and beer. This was the staple, the fuel that kept the machine of the palace running. This might be supplemented with a handful of onions or garlic, and perhaps on a special occasion, a small piece of fish. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for the tables of the elite. A servant could spend his entire day butchering and roasting the finest cuts of beef, his senses filled with the rich, tantalizing smell, only to end his day with a coarse, gritty loaf of barley bread and a cup of sour beer. The temptation must have been immense. To be surrounded by such plenty while your own stomach rumbled with hunger was a form of daily torture. And for some, the temptation was too much to resist. But stealing food from the palace kitchens was an incredibly risky proposition. The kitchens, like every other part of the palace, were run by a strict hierarchy of overseers. Scribes would meticulously record every sack of grain, every jar of oil, every head of cattle that entered the storerooms. Any discrepancy would be noted, and an investigation would be launched. The punishment for theft was severe. A servant caught stealing could be subjected to a brutal beating, with 100 strokes of a cane a common sentence. For a more serious offense, they could be sentenced to hard labor in the mines or quarries, a fate that was often a slow and miserable death sentence. In some
Chapter 5 Whispers in the Corridors. While the official hierarchy of the palace was a rigid pyramid of nobles, officials, and overseers, there was another, more fluid and far more dangerous power structure that existed in the shadows, the world of whispers and secrets. The servants of the palace, by the very nature of their work, were the invisible eyes and ears of the court. They moved through the private chambers, the audience halls, and the secluded gardens, silent and unobtrusive. They changed the royal bed linens, served the wine at private meetings, and stood guard in the quiet corridors late at night. They saw and heard everything. The political arguments between advisers, the secret meetings between lovers, the whispered complaints of a disgruntled noble, the ambitious plots of a rival for the throne. This knowledge was a heavy and dangerous burden. To know a secret was to hold a shard of power, but it was a shard that could cut both ways. A servant who learned of a plot against the Pharaoh faced a terrible choice. To report it could bring great reward, promotion, a gift of land, or a position of greater trust. But it could also be a death sentence. If the plotters were powerful and the servant's accusation could not be proven, they would surely face a terrible revenge. To remain silent was also a risk. If the plot were discovered by other means, the servant who knew of it and said nothing would be considered a co-conspirator, their life forfeit. The palace was a hotbed of intrigue and rivalry. Ambitious officials vied for the Pharaoh's favor, and they were not above using the servant class as their pawns. A servant might be bribed or blackmailed into spying on a rival, reporting on their private conversations, or searching their chambers for incriminating evidence.
To be drawn into these games of power was to walk a tightrope over a pit of crocodiles. A single misstep, a single misplaced word could lead to your downfall. A servant's loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold, but the price of betrayal was terrifyingly high. The fear of spies was pervasive. A servant could never be sure who was listening. The friendly conversation with a fellow cleaner in the laundry could be a trap, a test of one's loyalty. A careless complaint about the quality of the rations or the harshness of an overseer, if reported to the wrong person, could be twisted into an act of treason. This created an atmosphere of deep-seated paranoia and mistrust. Servants learned to keep their thoughts to themselves, to wear a mask of placid obedience at all times, to make themselves as small and as unnoticeable as possible. They communicated in coded language and subtle gestures, their faces trained to betray no emotion. False accusations were a constant danger. A jealous rival or a cruel overseer could easily ruin a servant's life with a simple fabricated story. With no legal rights and no one to speak for them, a servant had little chance of defending himself against the word of a superior. An accusation of theft, of laziness, of speaking disrespectfully of a noble, any of these could lead to a swift and brutal punishment with no questions asked. The truth was often irrelevant. What mattered was power, and the servants had none. They were the ghosts of the palace, their presence essential, but their existence unacknowledged, their lives hanging by the slender thread of the secrets they kept and the whispers they chose to ignore. They navigated a treacherous world where silence was their only shield, and where a single careless word could be as deadly as a scorpion's sting. Chapter 6. The Weight of Beauty. Among the servant class, there was a small elite group who lived and worked in the most intimate and dangerous proximity to the royal family, the body servants. These were the men and women entrusted with the sacred and terrifying task of tending to the physical body of the living God and his family. They were the hairdressers, the manicurists, the cosmeticians, the keepers of the royal wardrobe, and the attendants of the royal bath. Their positions were ones of great prestige, and they were often rewarded with better food, finer living quarters, and the cast-off jewelry and clothing of their royal masters. But the price of this intimacy was a life of unrelenting pressure and nerve-shredding anxiety. The ancient Egyptian elite placed a tremendous importance on their physical appearance. Beauty was not just a matter of vanity. It was a reflection of one's inner purity and status. A perfect appearance was a sign of being in harmony with Ma'at, the divine order. For the Pharaoh, this was doubly true. His physical body was a vessel for a god, and it had to be presented to the world as a flawless, perfect icon. The servants responsible for creating this image of perfection worked under a microscope. Consider the life of a royal hairdresser. The Egyptians, both men and women, often shaved their heads for cleanliness and to avoid lice, and wore elaborate wigs made of human hair, sometimes supplemented with vegetable fibers. These wigs were complex and heavy, intricately braided and curled, and often adorned with gold rings and precious beads. A hairdresser's job was not just to style the wig, but to maintain it, to clean it, and to fit it perfectly onto the pharaoh's head. The process was long and delicate, requiring a steady hand and immense concentration. The hairdresser would work for hours, their arms aching, knowing that a single misplaced strand, a single tug of the hair, could cause the pharaoh a moment of discomfort and bring his wrath down upon them. The application of cosmetics was an equally high-stakes art form. The kohl used to create the iconic almond-shaped Egyptian eye was a fine powder made from galena, which had to be mixed into a paste and applied with a small, delicate stick. The line had to be perfect, smooth, dark, and precise. A shaky hand, a smudge, a slight asymmetry would be a flaw on the face of the god, a visible imperfection for the entire court to see. The cosmetician would hold their breath with every stroke, their own fate tied to the steadiness of their hand. Life as a body servant was a life of physical discomfort. It required standing or kneeling for hours on end, often in cramped and awkward positions. It meant holding heavy mirrors of polished bronze, arranging the countless pleats of a linen robe, or massaging scented oils into the royal limbs until one's own muscles screamed in protest. It was a life lived in a state of constant, silent anticipation, trying to predict the master's needs before they were spoken, to fetch a drink of water, to adjust a cushion, to fan away a fly, all without being noticed, all without disrupting the serene, divine bubble that surrounded the royal person. They were closer to power than any other servant, yet they were also the most vulnerable. Their proximity meant that they were the most immediate and convenient target for a pharaoh's sudden flash of anger or irritation. The weight of beauty was a heavy one, and it was carried on the trembling shoulders of these silent, anonymous artists.
Chapter 7: Sickness and the Healer. In the hot, crowded confines of the palace, disease was a constant and unwelcome guest. The Nile, the source of all life in Egypt, also carried with it a host of water-borne illnesses. Mosquitoes bred in the irrigation canals and ornamental pools, spreading fevers. The close quarters of the servants' living areas were a fertile breeding ground for infections, and a simple sickness could quickly spread from one person to the next, threatening to cripple the workforce that kept the palace running. When sickness struck the royal family, the full force of Egyptian medical knowledge was brought to bear. The court physicians were highly respected and well-educated men. They combined practical, observational medicine with complex magical and religious rituals. A sick pharaoh would be attended by a team of specialists. There were physicians who specialized in the eyes, others in the stomach, and even some who were known as guardians of the royal anus. They would examine the patient, consult ancient medical texts written on papyrus, and prescribe a course of treatment. This treatment would often involve a mixture of practical remedies, herbal potions, salves, and carefully prepared foods, and magical incantations. A priest would be called in to recite spells to drive out the evil spirits or angry gods that were believed to be the cause of the illness. Amulets would be placed on the patient's body to protect them. No expense would be spared in the effort to heal the divine body of the king. For a servant, falling ill was a far more terrifying prospect. There was no team of specialists waiting to attend to them. The palace had healers, yes, but their primary focus was on the elite. A sick servant was a problem, a disruption to the smooth functioning of the household. If their illness was minor, a slight fever, a simple cut, a stomachache, they might receive a basic remedy from an overseer, a simple herbal poultice or a dose of a common purgative. But they would be expected to return to work as quickly as possible. A servant who was too sick to perform their duties was a servant who was not earning their rations. If the illness was more serious, the servant's fate was precarious. They would likely be moved to an infirmary, a designated area away from the main palace to prevent the disease from spreading. Here, the level of care was a world away from the royal chambers. They would be tended to by other servants, their treatments consisting of little more than basic folk remedies and prayers. The line between medicine and magic was blurry for all Egyptians, but for the poor and powerless, magic was often the only option. A desperate family member might buy a cheap amulet from a street vendor or recite a simple spell they had learned, hoping to appease the gods and win a recovery. For many servants, a serious illness was a death sentence. Without access to the best healers and the most potent remedies, their bodies had to fight the disease alone. Many would succumb to infections that might have been treatable in a wealthier patient. The palace, for all its splendor, was an unsentimental place. A servant who died was quickly replaced. Their body would be removed and their meager belongings distributed. Their absence would be a temporary inconvenience, a minor disruption that was quickly smoothed over. The great machine of the palace would continue to run, indifferent to the loss of one small, broken part. To be sick in the Pharaoh's palace was to be reminded in the most brutal way of your own disposability. Your health, your comfort, and your very life were of little consequence in the shadow of the eternal divine King. Chapter 8. A Love Forbidden. Within the grand and impersonal machinery of the palace, the servants were still human. They formed friendships, forged alliances, and, inevitably, they fell in love. In the shared drudgery of their daily lives, in the stolen moments of rest in a quiet courtyard, or in the crowded confines of their sleeping quarters, connections were made. A shared glance across a busy kitchen, a whispered word in a dimly lit corridor, a helping hand with a heavy load. These were the small seeds from which affection could grow. But in a world where every aspect of one's life was controlled, love was a dangerous and often forbidden luxury. For the servants of the Pharaoh's palace, there was no concept of a private life. Their time was not their own, their bodies were not their own, and their relationships were subject to the whims and needs of their masters. Marriages between servants were sometimes permitted, particularly if both individuals served the same household. A stable married couple could be seen as a more reliable and settled unit of labor.
But such a union was not a right. It was a privilege, one that had to be approved by an overseer or a higher official. The master's needs always came first. A servant could be sold or transferred to another estate, or sent to a distant temple as part of a royal donation, tearing them away from their loved one with no warning and no recourse. For many, particularly those in personal service to the royal family, marriage was simply not an option. They were expected to be completely devoted, their time and energy focused solely on the needs of their master. A romantic attachment was seen as a distraction, a competing loyalty that could not be tolerated. A secret relationship was a dangerous gamble. A couple caught in a clandestine meeting could face severe punishment. It could be seen as a neglect of duty, or worse, as a potential source of conspiracy and betrayal. The palace was a place of secrets, and an illicit love affair was a secret that could be used as leverage by a rival or an enemy. The fate of any children born to servants was also uncertain. A child born within the palace walls was born into a life of service. From a young age, they would be integrated into the household workforce, learning the tasks that would become their life's work. They were another resource, another pair of hands to serve the Pharaoh. For a servant parent, this was a bittersweet reality. They could keep their child with them, but they knew that their child's future was as constrained as their own, a continuation of the same cycle of servitude. And there was always the risk of separation. A child could be assigned to a different section of the palace or sent to another royal estate, with the parent having no say in the matter. The ultimate and most dangerous form of forbidden love was a relationship between a servant and a member of the elite, or, most unthinkable of all, a member of the royal family. Such a relationship would have been seen as a catastrophic breach of Ma'at, a pollution of the sacred social order. The historical records tell of a harem conspiracy against Pharaoh Ramesses III, in which members of his court plotted with servants to assassinate him. The punishment for those involved was death. Any servant, man or woman, who engaged in a romantic liaison with a person of higher status was playing with fire. The consequences, if discovered, would be absolute and merciless. Love, the most fundamental of human emotions, was a treasure that most servants could only dream of. A forbidden fruit in the gilded cage of the Pharaoh's palace.
Chapter 9. The Price of a Mistake. In the rigidly controlled world of the Pharaoh's palace, there was no room for error. A mistake was not simply a mistake. It was an offense, a disruption of the sacred order, an act of disrespect towards the divine king. And the system of justice within the palace walls was as swift and brutal as it was one-sided. For a servant, there was no presumption of innocence, no right to a trial by one's peers. There was only the accusation, the judgment, and the punishment. The most common form of punishment, the one that served as the constant, low-level background threat to a servant's daily existence, was the beating. The overseers, the men who managed the vast workforce of the palace, carried canes made of wood or reeds as a badge of their authority, and they were not hesitant to use them. A servant caught shirking their duties, being slow to respond to a command, or engaging in a moment of idle chatter, could be subjected to an immediate and painful beating on the spot. The blows would usually be aimed at the back, the shoulders, or the soles of the feet. This was casual, everyday violence designed to enforce discipline and remind everyone of their place. More serious offenses, such as a repeated failure to perform one's duties, would be met with a more formal and severe punishment, such as the 100 blows, a sentence that could leave a person permanently injured or even crippled. For more serious crimes, such as theft or a direct act of disobedience to a high official, the consequences were far graver. The servant would be dragged before a palace official who would act as both judge and jury. The proceedings were not designed to uncover the truth, but to confirm the servant's guilt. Confessions were often extracted through torture. The accused would be beaten until they admitted to the crime, regardless of whether they had actually committed it. Witnesses, if there were any, would be similarly intimidated. The judgment, once passed, was final. The punishments could be horrific. A thief might have their hand cut off, a permanent, visible mark of their crime. They might be branded, their skin seared with a hot iron to mark them as a criminal. For crimes that were considered a threat to the security or the sanctity of the palace, such as assault or conspiracy, the sentences were even more severe. The guilty party could be sentenced to a life of hard labor in the brutal desert mines or quarries, a place from which few ever return. Or they could be condemned to death. The methods of execution were designed to be terrifying deterrents: impalement on a sharpened stake, being burned alive, or being handed over to the devourer, a crocodile kept for the purpose of carrying out such sentences. There was no escape and no appeal. The word of a superior, any superior, was absolute. A servant's life was held in the hands of their masters, and it could be snuffed out on a whim. This constant threat of violence and brutal punishment was the invisible whip that kept the entire system running. It ensured obedience, discouraged dissent, and reinforced the unshakable power of the Pharaoh and the elite who surrounded him. The price of a single mistake, a moment of carelessness, or a false accusation could be your health, your freedom, or your very life. Justice was not a right. It was a privilege of the powerful, and for the servants of the palace it was a concept as distant and unattainable as the stars in the night sky. Chapter 10. Touches of Gold, Chains of Service. Life as a servant in the Pharaoh's palace was undeniably a life of hardship, but it was not entirely with its small compensations. For a person born into the poverty of a rural village, the palace did offer a certain kind of security. A servant was guaranteed a daily ration of food and beer, a place to sleep, and a degree of protection within the palace walls. In a world where famine, drought, and raids by desert nomads were a constant threat,
This was not an insignificant thing. The palace was the center of power and wealth, and those who lived within it, even at the lowest levels, benefited from the stability that this concentration of resources provided. There were also occasional perks, small glimmers of luxury in a life of drudgery. A body servant who pleased their master might be rewarded with a gift, a fine linen tunic that was no longer in fashion, a piece of jewelry that had a minor flaw, or a jar of scented oil. After a great festival or a royal banquet, the leftover food, which was still far grander than a servant's daily fare, might be distributed among the household staff. These were the touches of gold, the moments that made the life of a palace servant seem enviable to an outsider. To wear a cast-off garment that had once been worn by a noble, or to taste a delicacy that had been prepared for the king's table, was to have a brief, fleeting connection to the world of power and splendor they served. These small benefits, however, came at an enormous cost, the complete and total loss of personal freedom. A servant was, for all intents and purposes, the property of the Pharaoh. Their lives were not their own. They could not choose their work. They could not decide when to wake or when to sleep, and they could not leave the palace grounds without permission. Their movements were controlled, their relationships were policed, and their futures were decided by others. The stability they enjoyed was the stability of a well-cared-for tool, not the security of a free human being. This was the fundamental paradox of their existence. They lived at the heart of the Egyptian world, in the very presence of the living God, but they were utterly powerless. They witnessed the great affairs of state. They saw the tribute from foreign lands laid at the Pharaoh's feet, and they heard the plans for the building of magnificent temples. They were closer to the levers of power than anyone else in the kingdom. Yet they had no ability to influence them in any way. Their proximity to greatness only served to highlight their own insignificance. The touches of gold were just that, brief, superficial contacts with a world they could see and serve, but to which they could never truly belong. The chains of service were not made of iron, but they were no less real. They were forged from a lifetime of obedience, from the constant fear of punishment, and from the deeply ingrained belief in the divine order of the world. A servant was born to serve, just as a noble was born to rule, and the Pharaoh was born to be a god. To challenge this order was unthinkable. And so they accepted their lot. They cherished the small perks, the moments of kindness, the leftover scraps from the feast. But these small comforts could never outweigh the crushing reality of their situation. They were prisoners in a palace, bound by invisible chains to a life of unending labor, their own dreams and desires sacrificed at the altar of the divine King.
Chapter 11. The Long, Slow Decline. For a servant in the Pharaoh's palace, youth and strength were their only true assets. A young, strong body could endure the long hours of labor, the heavy lifting, and the endless walking on hard stone floors. A young, sharp mind could remember the complex rules of etiquette and navigate the treacherous currents of palace politics. But time, the great enemy of all mortals, was particularly cruel to those whose entire value was tied to their physical abilities. The process of growing old in the palace was a long, slow decline, marked by a growing sense of fear and insecurity. There was no concept of retirement in ancient Egypt. A person was expected to work for as long as they were able. For a servant, this meant continuing their duties long after their bodies had begun to fail them. The back that had been strained by decades of carrying heavy jars of water would ache with a persistent gnawing pain. The hands that had scrubbed countless linen garments would be gnarled with arthritis. The eyes that had been strained in the dim, torchlit corridors would grow cloudy. But still, they would be expected to rise before the dawn and perform their tasks. Their pace would slow, their movements would become more difficult, but the demands of the palace remained the same. This physical decline was accompanied by a decline in status and security. An older servant who could no longer perform their duties as efficiently as a younger, stronger person would be seen as a burden. They might be moved to less demanding, but also less prestigious tasks. A once proud body servant might find themselves relegated to simple mending work in the laundry or to the mind-numbingly dull task of grinding grain. This loss of position was not just a blow to their pride, it was a sign of their growing obsolescence. The greatest fear of an aging servant was being cast out. The palace was an unsentimental institution. An animal that could no longer pull a plow or a tool that was broken was discarded. And a servant who could no longer work was, in the eyes of their masters, no different. If they had no family within the palace to care for them, they could be dismissed, turned out of the only home they had ever known, to fend for themselves. For a person in their old age, with no savings, no property, and no physical strength, this was a death sentence. They would be forced to beg on the streets or rely on the charity of strangers, a miserable and ignominious end to a life of hard service. Even for those who were allowed to remain, their final years would be lived in the margins. They would be dependent on the kindness of their younger colleagues and the tolerance of their overseers. They would receive their daily rations, but they would be a ghost at the feast, a reminder of a past that was no longer useful. They had given their entire lives to the service of the Pharaoh, sacrificing their youth, their health, and their freedom. They had helped to build and maintain the splendor of the greatest kingdom on earth. Their reward in the end was to be forgotten, to fade away into the shadows of the palace, their long years of loyal service counting for nothing once their strength had finally failed. The long, slow decline was a journey into powerlessness and invisibility, a final, bitter lesson in their own disposability. Chapter 12. An Unmarked Tomb. The ultimate obsession of the ancient Egyptians, from the pharaoh on his divine throne to the humble farmer in his mud-brick hut, was the afterlife. They believed that death was not an end, but a transition to another eternal existence in a paradise known as the Field of Reeds. But this journey was a perilous one, and it required extensive preparation. For the pharaoh, the preparations were on a scale that the world had never seen before and has rarely seen since.
His death was a cosmic event that required the construction of a magnificent tomb, a pyramid or a hidden chamber in the Valley of the Kings, filled with everything he would need for eternity. Treasures of gold and lapis lazuli, furniture, clothing, food, wine, and even boats to sail the celestial Nile. His body would be subjected to the most elaborate and expensive form of mummification, a 70-day process designed to preserve his physical form forever. A host of priests would perform complex rituals, reciting the spells from the Book of the Dead that would guide him past the demons and dangers of the underworld and ensure his successful rebirth as a god. For the servant who had spent their life in the Pharaoh's shadow, death was a far simpler and more uncertain affair. Their dream was the same, to reach the field of reeds, to live a life free from toil and hardship. But their resources were infinitely smaller. There would be no grand tomb for a servant. If they were lucky, their family might be able to afford a simple burial in the sand at the edge of the desert. A small pit would be dug, and the body, wrapped in a simple linen shroud, would be placed inside. There would be no elaborate mummification. The hot, dry sand of the desert would naturally desiccate the body, preserving it in a rudimentary fashion, but it was a far cry from the godlike preservation of the king. Instead of a treasury of golden objects, the servant's grave would contain only a few humble possessions. A clay bowl that might have held a final offering of food, a simple wooden amulet to provide some small measure of magical protection, perhaps a worn-out tool that they had used in life. These were the pathetic, hopeful provisions for a journey into eternity. They had no access to the powerful priests or the sacred texts that were the exclusive property of the elite. Their knowledge of the afterlife came from popular beliefs and folk traditions, a simplified and often garbled version of the complex theology of the state religion. The greatest fear was that they would not make it, that their spirit would fail the final judgment before the god Osiris, that their heart would be found heavy with sin and would be devoured by the monster Amit, condemning them to utter oblivion for all eternity. Their whole life had been a struggle for survival, and their death was the beginning of one final terrifying test. They had lived a life of anonymity, their individual identity subsumed by their role as a servant. And in death, they would achieve a final, lasting invisibility. Their simple grave would be unmarked, its location quickly lost to the shifting sands of the desert. They would leave no monument, no inscription, no record of their name or their deeds. They were the invisible foundation upon which the glorious eternal civilization of Egypt was built, and their reward was to be utterly forgotten by the world they had so faithfully served. As you finally surrender to the peaceful embrace of sleep, let this be the final thought. The great pyramids and golden treasures that we so admire are the monuments not only to the power of kings, but also to the silent, unrecorded sacrifices of the countless servants who lived and died in an unmarked tomb.
Chapter 13. The Festival of Drudgery. Once or twice in a generation, if the gods willed it, and the kingdom was prosperous, the Pharaoh might decree a Heb-Sed festival, a grand jubilee to celebrate 30 years of his reign, and to magically rejuvenate his divine powers. For the nobles and the citizens of Thebes, this was a time of unparalleled celebration. The city would be transformed. Brightly colored banners would hang from every building. The temples would be thrown open, and the air would hum with the joyous sounds of music, singing, and feasting. It was a public spectacle of the highest order, a demonstration of the Pharaoh's enduring power and the favor of the gods. The people would receive extra rations of bread and beer, and for a few glorious days, the entire kingdom would be caught up in a wave of collective euphoria. But for the servants in the palace, the Heb-Sed festival was not a time of celebration. It was a time of unrelenting, back-breaking, and nerve-shredding labor. The preparations would begin months, even years in advance, and the workload would increase exponentially as the date of the festival approached. The palace had to be made more than perfect. It had to be a shining, flawless reflection of divine majesty. Every wall had to be scrubbed, every floor polished until it shone like a mirror, every painted column touched up by skilled artisans. The palace grounds would be a hive of activity, with extra storerooms being built, temporary pavilions being erected, and vast quantities of food, wine, and linen being brought in from every corner of the kingdom. The servants were the engine that drove this massive undertaking. They worked from before sunrise until long after sunset. Their already long days stretched to the absolute limits of human endurance. They would haul endless loads of stone and timber for the construction crews. The laundry servants would work in shifts, day and night, washing and pleating the thousands of fine linen garments required for the court. In the kitchens, the heat and the pressure were almost unbearable. The cooks and bakers, their faces flushed and their bodies slick with sweat, would prepare mountains of food for the endless banquets, their work overseen by frantic, shouting officials who knew that any failure would reflect directly on them. During the festival itself, the servants' work reached a fever pitch. They were a silent, invisible army, moving through the throngs of celebrating nobles, their arms laden with trays of food and heavy jars of wine. They refilled cups, cleared away discarded plates, and fanned the heated faces of the feasting elite. They had to be everywhere at once, anticipating every need. Yet they had to remain unseen, unheard, their movements swift and silent, so as not to disrupt the festivities. They would catch fleeting glimpses of the magnificent ceremonies, the grand processions, the sacred dances, the pharaoh, clad in brilliant gold, running a ritual race to prove his physical vitality. They would hear the joyous music and the laughter, but they were not a part of it. They were merely the stage crew for a play in which they had no speaking role. The exhaustion was bone deep, a physical and mental weariness that was almost impossible to describe. Their muscles ached, their feet were swollen and raw, and their minds were numb from lack of sleep. And woven through it all was the constant gnawing fear of making a mistake. During a sacred festival, a dropped tray, a spilled jug of wine, or a clumsy misstep was not just an accident. It was a bad omen, a sacrilege.
The punishment for such an offense, committed in the full view of the court, would be swift and merciless. And so they moved through the joyous chaos in a bubble of intense, fearful concentration, their faces blank masks of servitude, while the rest of the kingdom celebrated the rejuvenation of their king. The servants felt only the crushing weight of their own exhaustion, their bodies and spirits being consumed to fuel the magnificent, glorious, and utterly indifferent spectacle. Chapter 14. The Indifference of the Gods. In the life of a palace servant, the gods were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They were everywhere in the grand public displays of religion. The servant's day was framed by the rituals performed in the great temples whose walls loomed over the palace. They would hear the distant chanting of the priests of Amun-Ra, see the smoke from the morning offerings rising into the sky, and stand aside with downcast eyes as solemn processions carried the sacred bark of a god through the palace grounds. The gods were on the painted walls of the corridors they cleaned, their serene and powerful faces gazing down from a world utterly removed from their own. The gods were in the elaborate titles of their masters, in the oaths their overseers swore, and in the very name of the divine Pharaoh they served. But these were the gods of the state, the great cosmic deities who concerned themselves with the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, and the fate of the kingdom. They were the patrons of the pharaoh and the nobility. They belonged to the world of power, of wealth, of grand temples and elaborate rituals. For the average servant, these gods were distant, intimidating figures. To what god could a servant pray for relief from an aching back? Would Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, concern himself with a stolen loaf of bread? Would Horus, the divine protector of the pharaoh, care about the cruelty of a minor overseer? The grand religion of the state offered little comfort for the small daily miseries of a servant's life. It was a religion to be served, not one that served you. And so, in the quiet corners of their lives, in the cramped sleeping quarters and the humble workshops, a different kind of faith might have flickered. Here, the servants would have turned to smaller, more personal deities, gods who understood the struggles of the common person. They might have left a tiny offering of a flower or a drop of beer for Bes, the dwarf god who protects households and watched over mothers and children. They might have whispered a prayer to Taweret, the fierce hippopotamus goddess who guarded against the dangers of childbirth. They might have worn a simple, crudely made amulet of the household god of their family, a small, secret source of comfort and protection against the vast, impersonal forces that governed their lives. This was a quiet, practical, and often desperate faith. It was a faith concerned not with the fate of the empire, but with the immediate, pressing needs of survival. A prayer for a fever to break, for a child to be born healthy, for a beating to be avoided. And woven through it all was the hope of the afterlife. The belief in the final judgment before Osiris was perhaps the only truly democratic element in the Egyptian worldview. In the Hall of Two Truths, it was not one's rank or wealth that mattered, but the purity of one's heart. A servant could hold on to the secret, burning hope that their life of hardship and honest labor would be rewarded, that their cruel master would be punished, and that in the eternal field of reeds they would finally find the peace, abundance, and dignity that had been denied to them in life. This was the ultimate solace. The great God